My name's Tobi Hanna-Davies, and I first got active in Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, which was what raised my awareness about how much people can do to make a change in national policy. Also gave me a lot of confidence as a speaker and helped me know how to be an activist. So I was very excited to find of the sister city work happening between Ann Arbor and Nicaragua, and the sister church work, and the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice. And I got involved in all of those at the end of the 80s. And I'm really glad to be here with Gregory, because Gregory Fox had a lot of sister city experience and leadership. Why don't you tell about what your part was?
I'm Gregory Fox. I'm a freelance photographer in Ann Arbor, and I was involved in Latin American issues, mostly Central America. Nicaragua was big in the news in those days. There was a group at the University of Michigan called the Latin American Solidarity Committee, and I was involved to some degree with them. And this was during the Reagan regime, and there was a low-intensity warfare being waged on Nicaragua. And we were trying to think of a way to make it more real for people here. The Nicaraguans were dying, but we didn't know about it here much. And so we thought Sister City might be a way to bring it home. It was an example of thinking globally and acting locally. Ann Arbor already had a couple sister cities, so we thought, how about one in Central America? And we considered approaching city council to designate a sister city. That's how it had been done in the past. But the experience from the Vietnam War was that city council was very reluctant to get involved in international issues. And while there was a Democratic majority that would have been sympathetic, we thought that they really didn't want to take this on and that they'd take a lot of heat for it. So we thought a better way to approach this was the ballot proposal. And this way we went around city council, we went direct to the people, more democratic, and it was an educational process as well. So there was a campaign leading up to it. First we had to collect signatures, which was a lot of work, and we had crucial help from, Kim Kratz and her group. But I've been
Sane Freeze.
Yes, Sane Freeze. When this would have been in 1986, early 1986. The work began in 85, talking about it. It started off as a few small meetings, and we had a core of people, and we worked out a strategy how to do this. And so we gathered signatures, then there was a campaign, and with literature to be produced. And this way, because people were going to vote on it, we felt that they would get more attention. We even got an endorsement from the Ann Arbor News in an editorial, which was quite an achievement, we thought, because they had earlier endorsed Reagan for president, and we didn't consider them to be on our side. But what we were trying to show people is that the war in Central America, the low-intensity warfare being waged in Central America, also hurt people here. We were losing lots of federal funding, block grants, and other reductions in federal support for local communities was being spent on war. And we won that ballot proposal rather handily, almost 2-1. And so we're able to set up an official, with a city committee to choose a sister city, one or more sister cities in Central America. And we settled on Huigalpa, Nicaragua, and had a first trip down to Nicaragua in late 1986, I think November 86. It was during an election here. And one of our members of our delegation, Perry Bullard, was reelected to office while in Nicaragua. We had Mayor Ed Pierce and his wife. We had former Mayor Pro Tem Leroy Capret and former Mayor Pro Tem Joyce Chesbrough as elected officials. Were you, Tobi, were you on that trip? I think you were.
I went on the religious delegation, which was both sister church and sister city. And then I went on 3 more delegations as a representative of Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice.
The first delegation got a lot of attention. The Ann Arbor News sent a writer and photographer with us, and he was regularly calling in articles. In those days, you couldn't fax them, you couldn't email them, you had to speak them over the phone, and somebody at the Ann Arbor News was desperately trying to write it down as he dictated it. And we had a lot of attention upon returning. So this put Nicaragua on the front page of the Ann Arbor News, and then there was a campaign to get a garbage truck. And many people, when they hear about Sister City, would say, oh yes, the garbage truck. This was a health issue. We wanted to support projects of public health and education. And sanitation is a big issue. Cholera is a leading cause of death among children. And we asked the people in Huigalpa, what do they need? And a garbage truck was their request. We raised the money privately to get a garbage truck. And it was driven from here down to Huigalpa. New Yorker magazine sent a writer out who rode with the garbage truck on his first couple days and wrote a story that was in the New Yorker magazine. There were a number of delegations went after that into the early 1990s. Our connection with ICPJ was monetary. We wanted to get a rating as a 501c3 tax-deductible nonprofit. It's complicated and expensive, but we could come in under the wing of ICPJ and therefore collect funds tax-free, and they handled our money for us, which was very handy for us. And
you also had a philosophical connection.
absolutely, a
lot of
philosophical
support.
connection. And when we had some visitors from Nicaragua, from Huigalpa here, the ICPJ office was the command center.
We should talk about the wonderful project of the composting toilets. That was a Sister City project that was very impressive to me when I went down. Another hygiene project where Sister City actually sent an engineer down, a woman who helped people from Huigalpa put composting toilets in many of the poorest neighborhoods. And that is, I mean, it should have been done so much more than it has been. It's so much better than just building latrines. People had nothing, essentially. That engineer, Laura, had this wonderful relationship with the people there who were doing the digging and the building. And then the composting toilet was available to a whole neighborhood.
Yes, Laura Orlando. And we had critical help from Clevis Multrum, who was a maker of composting toilets. Now, we were not installing Clevis Multrum toilets, but it was based on their design, a much simpler system made of cement that could be made there. And Abby Rockefeller of the Rockefeller families was the owner of Clevis Multrum, and she provided assistance to us as well for this project.
So when one of my delegations that I went on went down, we all carried in our luggage as many toilet seats as we could, and they were made in Sweden.
Yes,
somehow the
Swedish
Swedish ones were better.
For me, Sister City was this amazing combination of feeling like you were actually able to do something to help make a difference for the people, that our government was, part of the atrocities there, very complicit. So we were helping, but really we were getting so much more out of going, just like all of you have experienced with what you get from seeing the world from the point of view of people who are at the other end of U.S. military might and economic power. And understanding how the people of Nicaragua viewed the Sandinistas compared to the propaganda that we heard up here, it was really eye-opening. To hear Nicaraguan leaders at different levels, from different parties, different political parties, tell about their history as a nation compared to how it was told to us in this country. The Sister City time was really important for this city. You worked so hard on that, Gregory. I just want to thank you for all your leadership. I just want to add the importance of the sister churches, because 2 churches here had sister churches, and still do, as far as I know, in Nicaragua. And when we went on sister city delegations, we usually combined and also visited the sister churches of First Baptist and of Church of the Incarnation. And that was a wonderful combination because we saw different parts of Nicaragua, and we saw the religious perspective on the Sandinista government and on the Catholic Church in Nicaragua, and on the United States actions towards Nicaragua. So we had many clergy go from Ann Arbor with their sister church visits with their own denomination or others. It was good interfaith work as well.
Hi, my name's Rebecca Canner, and I first got involved in the Latin America Task Force, which was then called the Religious Coalition on Central America, in 1986, when there was a group of people who were very involved in what was going on in Central America. There was a ballot initiative that happened, and I think I made some phone calls on that, but I wasn't involved in this issue at all. But this group of people wanted to form a committee, a group of people, a coalition from the religious community. So my Rabbi Kensky at Beth Israel Congregation, received a note card saying there was going to be an initial meeting and would he come. And so he knew that I was involved in a number of political things, and so he had one of his staff people give me a call. So I got a call from Martha saying, Rabbi would ask if you could go to this meeting for him. So I went to the meeting in 1986, and it was at St. Andrew's Church. And at that point, I led a pretty sheltered life in the Jewish community and hadn't been in many churches and didn't know a lot of the church language. But this group formed, and there was Kim Groom from the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice at this meeting. And we met once, and then we scheduled a second meeting, and a number of the people who had been involved suggested it would be best to be part of the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice. So then we became a task force. And as I said, the name was the Religious Coalition on Central America. And I found this article that Kim Groom, the staff person, had wrote, and she said the mission was to stop U.S. intervention in Central America and to make it clear to the religious community that U.S. policy in Central America should be an issue of concern to all people of faith. So we were very committed to making an interfaith group. And I had my own personal education. At one point, we were planning a program, and we were deciding who would do what, and they said, well, who will give the homily? And I had never even heard that word before. So I did learn that, and I hadn't been in many churches before that. And soon learned all about the different churches of Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County. A couple of things that happened in the 80s was in March of 87, there was a clothing drive and the cost of the cargo container was shared between the Religious Coalition and Sister City. And it was to go to clothing went to Nicaragua, but there was also clothing that went to refugees who were in Canada. In January of 88, $4,800 was raised to buy 4,000 pounds of milk, 1 glass of milk for each of 108,000 children. In July of 88, there was a demonstration at the Federal Building to protest the U.S. trade embargo against Nicaragua. And in October of 88, there was a discussion on how to bring more attention to the situation in El Salvador. And as we worked with the Sister City program, we took up collections. In 88 was the hurricane, the Nicaraguan hurricane, and so we did a lot of support around that. And in December of 88, Don Coleman reported on his work with Witness for Peace. in January, we raised more money, of 89, we raised more money to rebuild after Hurricane Joan. So we also did some lobbying. We met with Representative Carl Purcell to talk about his voting on these issues. And our coalition grew, and more people got active. And I wanted to, and Tobi was the staff person for the Interfaith Council, and Marianne, as soon as she moved back to town, she jumped in with full force and has been active ever since. So I'll let them talk a little bit about their experiences.
My name is Mary Ann Perrone, and I have lived in Ann Arbor a couple of different times. And I first got involved with Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice back in 1978. And at that time, we had two task forces, the Hunger Task Force and the Disarmament Working Group. And they were so related that most of us were involved in both in one way or another, working on disarmament issues, nuclear disarmament, as well as hunger. For me, as we worked on hunger, and that was my first conduit into ICPJ, many of the case stories that we looked at for looking at root causes of hunger. We weren't in the business of alleviating hunger particularly, but of looking at root causes. And Central America at that time, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and indeed a lot of Latin America provided some of the best case studies. A place like El Salvador, this is just in the lead up to their civil war, but certainly a lot of violence. But the fact that 14 families owned 80% of the arable land was a root cause of hunger, and that's true around the world. And right here in our hemisphere, there was where the United States was supporting dictators and military regimes. We had a case study to look at. So the hunger work led me into Latin America work, and work that I have not stopped doing, solidarity work, all of these years. It took me away from Ann Arbor for a while, and in fact, our family went to Bolivia, South America, for 3 years as Maryknoll lay missioners. But in 1990, we returned to Ann Arbor, and once again, I found Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice a home for me and for my commitments. And by that time, we had the Religious Coalition on Latin America. The name had changed to include all of Latin America. And the staff person through the 90s that I worked most closely with is Tobi Hanna-Davies. And she and I are going to talk about some of our work together in the 90s.
This is Tobi Hanna-Davies. I was hired by Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice as assistant director when Donna Ainsworth was director. And I remember having to persuade the steering committee to hire someone because they were feeling that their budget was too short. And I said, I won't need any health care. I'm sorry for all the staff that I set that precedent for since then. And I really wanted to do this work. I was so excited about the work that Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice had been doing. I'd saved every single newsletter that I'd ever received since I first discovered them several years before. And I was very pleased to get a half-time job as assistant director, and a little alarmed when Donna Ainsworth left for a job after about a year and a half to work at the university. And at that point, I became director and was director for essentially all of the 90s. And the work that was done by every task force was so impressive and so amazing looking back on it. But the Latin America Task Force had some very special qualities, and one of them was having Mary Ann Perrone join our task force because every event that the Latin America Task Force put on was very tied to the the issues, the pain being caused in a Latin American country with our government's complicity. And it was tied to our faith values. Why all of us, whatever our faith, tradition, are called to call our government to better behavior, and our congregations, our denominations as well. And everything that was done was so good at engaging the community in a way that would both inspire and educate and make a difference. We have a number of really good examples of that. And the first one was the first big one to talk about was 1992.
In 1991 was the dinner.
Oh, let's talk about that first,
Yes.
because that came first. Go ahead, Mary Ann.
I think as in another segment, we talked about our relationship with Nicaragua through Sister City. But one of the things that was happening in 1991, when we were so aware of the poverty, the tremendous poverty in Nicaragua, and our government's both low-intensity warfare and the Contra War that we waged against them. And at that time, in 1991, a very prominent person here in Ann Arbor, Tom Monahan, founder of and owner of Domino's Pizza, a very religious man, decided that what Nicaragua needed was a new cathedral. And this sat very poorly with the Solidarity community throughout the United States and in Nicaragua. To think that in a place where we had waged war during the 80s, and to which we had involved ourselves in their election process to get right-wing government in place, and where we had given much military aid to a dictatorship in the past. We're giving no significant aid for food, shelter, health, education. And here there was now in the United States, in a part of the religious community, a big effort to raise money to build a cathedral. And so a group of Catholic people in the area came to our task force and said, we want to do something about this. Because here in Ann Arbor, because it was Domino's Farms and Mr. Monahan, there was to be a huge event, starting with a mass at St. Francis Church with several cardinals from throughout the United States invited, as well as all the priests of the area. The Catholic churches were asked to have envelopes in their Sunday masses so that people could donate to this cathedral. Again, not to food, not to clothing, not to education or health in Nicaragua, but in this for a cathedral. And in addition to this mass, then all of the people at the mass were to proceed over to the Michigan League, where there would be a $500 a plate dinner that would raise money for the cathedral. And of course, only rich people could attend this dinner with the cardinals, and that was their fundraising event, which is their right. But it's also our right to have a voice about what we think about this and to call attention to the poor in Nicaragua and those who have been impoverished in many ways through our military action. So, yes, why don't you tell the response, and then there's two things that I would like to add.
I thought it was brilliant. I think this was Mary Ann's idea, but it could have come from the group, that in response to the $500 a plate dinner, we had a 5 cents a plate rice and beans dinner. and outside the $500 a plate dinner, and all of the people going into the $500 a plate dinner needed to walk by us. And we got the best media coverage for all of this. The number of clippings about this whole event was fabulous for raising awareness in this community.
And I'd like to point out a couple of the things. We came from, we were members of the religious community, coming from a very deep spiritual and religious conviction, and we used a couple of the Christian scriptures in large banners that kind of exemplified what we were talking about. And one of them was, when your child asks you for bread, who among you would give them a stone? Referring, of course, to the bricks and concrete of the cathedral instead of feeding hungry people and children. The second was from the Epistle of St. James that said, when you give a banquet, invite the widow and the orphan to feast with you, which did not happen in the $500 a plate dinner, but out on the sidewalk, 5 cents a plate, it did happen.
I have a Ann Arbor News coverage that has a picture showing Marianne and a lot of other people holding signs that I made, and one says, Monaguans with no potable water, no electricity, no health care, 54.5%. And another one says compassion.
Related to that is the very next year, in 1992, it was the 500th anniversary of what some people call the encounter between the New World and the Old World, between Europe and this continent. And throughout the Americas, I can report that in Latin America itself, this was a very big year to take a look at, because it's 500 years of, for many of them, of domination, but also 500 years of resistance. And so we, the Religious Coalition on Latin America of ICPJ, did a very, very big event that took place in Battle Creek, Michigan. Tobi and I worked together very closely on this. I remember our trips back and forth to Battle Creek, having to get home in time.
And the reason it was in Battle Creek
Yes.
is
Go ahead.
because that's the place where Sojourner Truth is buried. The slave who became the most powerful abolitionist speaker as a woman and as a former slave, has traveled all across the country. Of all places in the whole nation, it's Battle Creek where she's buried. So this was a joint effort with the Racial and Economic Justice Task Force and the Religious Coalition on Latin America Interfaith, both task forces of interfaith. And we had a caravan of cars. So many people filled 24 cars at least. And I remember putting streamers on the antennas of all the cars and signs on the windows. And we all drove just below the speed limit so everyone would pass us and read the signs on our car windows so that our message would get to everybody as they drove past.
And joining us were caravans from Lansing, from Kalamazoo, and from Jackson, all converging on Battle Creek. So we had allies throughout this part of Michigan. And because our focus was on this encounter, this 500 years of resistance, we were reminded that it wasn't just the Native American peoples in this continent that started becoming oppressed at that moment and needing to resist, but also that nearly from the very beginning, people were enslaved in Africa and brought to this country, and that they have been part of this story of oppression and domination and resistance throughout. And so that's why Sojourner Truth. We had Native American dancers there. We had litanies of resistance and litanies for truth to name this, that this was not a discovery of America. This was an invasion, and certainly an encounter, and that and the beginning of a genocide for the American Indian.
At the time, there was a lot in the national media about 500 years anniversary of Columbus' arrival in 1492. But a lot of people didn't seem to have read it. A lot of people still seem to believe the myth that we were all taught in elementary school about the great discoveries by Columbus, and nobody seemed to know the terrible atrocities that he committed against the people of the island that's now Dominican Republic and Haiti, and the way people's hands were chopped off if they didn't bring him enough gold. And the fact that Interfaith Council held up the quincentenary as 500 years of resistance to that mentality of conquest and domination is really important. One of the other pieces you didn't mention was Sojourner Truth herself. Her Ain't I a Woman talk was portrayed fabulously by Elise Bryant with Yarrow Halstead. It was a wonderful coming together of many people who are resisting now and have been all on the various issues where we all need to work.
So this is Rebecca, and Toby and Mariana and I are going to talk about one subject that our task force, Latin American Task Force, has been working on since 1995. In 1995, we brought Father Roy Bourgeois to town, and we showed the Academy Award-nominated short documentary School of Assassins at the Michigan Theater. And there it was, up in lights. Our representative, Lynn Rivers, spoke. We had a reception with food from El Salvador, from Pilar's Catering, and it introduced me, it introduced many people to the U.S. Army School of the Americas. And from there, we sent a delegation in March to Washington, D.C., which was on Archbishop Oscar Romero's anniversary, to join this fast on the Capitol steps to close the School of the Americas. And I didn't go on this, so Marianne, were you there, and Toby?
No, I was not there.
All right, well, we sent someone, because it's in our notes.
Yes, we did. We sent some people. We had a send-off, yeah.
And then that was in March, and then in not the following November and not the November afterwards, but in 1997, we sent our first delegation to Columbus, Georgia, where the School of the Americas is located on the base of Fort Benning. And just to give a little introduction, the school was started in Panama in the late 40s, and the idea was to keep communism out of our hemisphere by the powers that be, and it trained Latin American soldiers. Nearly every atrocity in Latin America since that time has had a connection where the military has been trained at the school. And in 1984, as part of, I believe, the Panama Canal Treaty, it was moved from there, and a former president of Panama called it the biggest destabilizing factor in the hemisphere. And so it was moved to Columbus, Georgia, and there has been a vigil outside the gates every year since 1990. And we sent our first delegation in 1997, and I'll let you two fill in more about that.
I think I went the first time and the other times because you had gone, Rebecca. So I dared to do it because I was going with you
Well, we actually went together the first time. We
Was
were the
that your
first
first time,
delegation.
too?
You flew, I drove, and then we had a couple of vans that we got from the University of Michigan. And you flew with Jim Califas and I forget her name and her dog.
Oh,
So
yeah.
and
Margie Miner.
yeah, Margie Miner, and we had a bunch of students, and we were there, and it changed our lives.
That's absolutely right. I recommend everybody listening to this go to Fort Benning in November, around the 16th of November, on a weekend before Thanksgiving. It's very powerful to be part of the annual vigil there and to understand from all the Latin American speakers and entertainers what it's like to be on the other end of American policy and what the Latin American soldiers that come to the School of the Americas in Georgia do when they get back to their countries. There's so much connection with atrocities. No matter what the school says they're teaching about human rights, what actually happens is like what we saw in Nicaragua with the Contra being the army, the side that the U.S. supported, which had been Somoza's terrible guard. The same kind of behavior of terrorizing the people in their own countries is what's happening by people trained by our military.
I think maybe one of the most important things that we can say about what we call SOA work, SOA Watch work, is that from that time forward, Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice has sent delegations every single year to Fort Benning in November, and every year to Washington, D.C. in April to lobby to close the school. So we go to the site of the school to call for its closing, and then we go to where the deciders are in Congress in April. And sometimes we have had vanfuls and carfuls, and then that turned into busloadfuls. And somewhere we have all the numbers, but we have had as many as 85
85
people.
in 1998.
Yeah, that went from here, from this part of Michigan. We have partnered with people in Kalamazoo and Detroit and Alma and Adrian and some from Northern Ohio to ride together. It has been a focal point of a lot of our organizing, both because we want the school to close and because it epitomizes the military might that has backed up U.S. Foreign policy, both geopolitically and economically in the region from its inception, from the 40s on, very purposefully. And so it helps us understand and brings into our awareness all of the issues that we have been dealing with in many, many Latin American countries, and immigration to our own country today. And I think we'll talk more a little later about some of these issues that we're working on today. But throughout all of this time that we've been working on SOA Watch and to close the school, we've really been educating people and acting, doing actions on behalf of changing U.S. foreign policy in many different arenas that always have a connection to the school, but that are not directly related.
I want to talk a little bit about the ripple effect of us going there and being there. Part of the action there is a witness to be there, is education. The movement to close the school also has been very important aspect of it has been nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience. So the first time I went down in '97, a group of us crossed the line onto the base, and it was illegal trespassing. and we were banned from the base. For those of us, it was the first time we received a letter saying we were banned for 5 years. There was a group of 25 people who had crossed before, and they were indicted, and then they were sent to prison for 6 months. So the next year, I decided not to cross because I wasn't willing to accept the possible consequences. And it was a very difficult thing because when I did that action, it just felt so holy. And I quoted the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel as he wrote to his family after he walked with Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery, and said it was as if he was praying with his legs. And that's how it felt when we walked onto that base. And the next year I decided not to, and it was one of the hardest things for me not to do it. And then it turns out they didn't arrest anyone, and I felt like, oh, I could have done it. But in 2000, again, I crossed, and they did arrest people. They gave people a choice. If you walk out now, you won't be arrested. If you get on the buses, we will process you. And there were over 1,000 people who did it. And the following March, I received a letter that I was indicted and was going to be tried. So my trial was in May of 2001. And at the trial, I had 25 co-defendants, and most of us were sentenced to 6 months in prison. And we didn't go right away because we put money down to self-report. And in July, I needed to report to prison. But in between that May trial and my reporting to prison was probably the most active time to do all the things that over the past few years I should have been doing, calling the Ann Arbor News, and they did a story on it. And I, at my work at the Ecology Center, was a member of the UAW, so I made a phone call to the UAW to ask them to put something in their magazine that went at that time to over 1 million households, 1.5 million household of UAW members and their retirees. And with the help of then Vice President Bob King, they did do an article. And then Bob King said to me, well, what else can I do to support you? And I said, well, you can go to Fort Benning in November, as I've asked other family and friends to go because I'll be in prison. And he did go down on his own, and from that date in 2001, he has returned every year, and he then became the president of the UAW and helped sponsor a couple of buses, and there have been hundreds of people from the UAW over those years who have gone down, and Bob brought Father Roy Bourgeois to speak at his meetings of UAW people from all over the country, so that was one huge ripple, and we all have ripple stories to tell of how our actions have, we can never know the consequences. You have to do what speaks to you and what's true, and then amazing things happen.
It was very impressive the way you handled that whole period of going to prison. And I was very honored that I got to come and visit you in Peking.
Not just visit me, you escorted me and made some of your wonderful signs at our send-off, because I was at a prison with 9 other people from SOA, so including Sister Dorothy Hennessy, the 88-year-old nun. And your mother came, too.
My mother is getting close to up in her 80s as well. Yeah, then that was the nun who refused to take a lesser sentence than everyone else who was going to 6 months of prison.
Yeah, and I had a lot of qualms in between the time I first crossed and when I crossed in again on how effective this was, because I heard from some of the people when I went down in 98 who just got out of prison, and they all talked about their experience and how they're all working on prison reform, and thought it was a diverting experience, that it takes you away from SOA watch work. You can't be doing the work you need to do while you're in prison. So I don't like the way that people pull out the person who goes to prison, because I very much think the supporters are just as important, if not more so, than the person who goes to prison. So it's really important to have an affinity group, a support group, and I had that in Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice and the Latin America Task Force. But once I did that experience, I was totally convinced how important it was, and that prison witness really shines a light on an issue, because there's so many issues for people to be concerned about. But when you know someone who did that, and even when we'd go to Washington and you'd meet with these aides of our elected officials and talk about, being in prison for 6 months, they shouldn't, but they take you more seriously. I mean,
Yes, they should. They should, because you were willing to risk that. You were ready to speak eloquently on why you did. And when you got a chance, you did speak eloquently. If they let you, sometimes they won't even hear you.
well, we were a great team when we go to prison, and when we went to D.C. Because Mary Ann would talk about her vast experience in the region, and then Tobi would talk about organizing here, and we'd have other members with us, and we were a great group as we lobbied over the years.
Everybody listening should know that you don't have to risk going to prison if you go to the School of America's protests at Fort Benning, Georgia. You can participate whatever level is right for you, but you're definitely going to be inspired.
I would like to fill in that one of our members, also Chuck Booker Hirsch, a Presbyterian pastor here in Ann Arbor at the time, now in Bethesda, Maryland, also went to prison for 3 months for crossing the line. So these are our two luminaries here, and people from throughout the United States have I think it's close to 300 people who have crossed the line.
And what
over the
about
years.
Abby Schlaff, who was on our staff?
She didn't.
Well, she tried. She got arrested. And,
Many of us got arrested, but
Right.
only those two have been to prison.
I'm Rich Stahler-Shulk. I teach political science at Eastern Michigan University, and I came to Ann Arbor in 1997 and have been involved with the Latin America Task Force of ICPJ since then. Before that, I was involved in Latin America solidarity over the years, starting in the 1970s with the military coups in a number of South American countries in particular, doing solidarity work. That was the era of the infamous disappearance technique, where military regimes backed by the U.S. government would forcibly disappear people as a way of sort of implementing state terrorism against the entire population to cow people against resistance. And then in the 1980s, I was involved in the Central American movements that ICPJ has been so involved in through all these years as well. And I lived in Nicaragua for 5 years during that period, during the time of the Sandinista revolutionary government. And then in the 1990s, I started to get involved in solidarity with Mexico since the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, and that was the time when I came to Ann Arbor and was very pleased to see such an active Latin America solidarity group here to be involved with and plug into.
And this is Mary Ann, and I'll be joining Rich here to talk about his time in the Latin America Task Force and up to present day. But I'd like to really ask you, Rich, you are a professor at EMU of political science, specializing in Latin America, and you're an academic, and you teach and write and research, but you're also an activist, and we don't often find that combination. So we're very delighted to have you embody that combination, but talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you know other academics in your own discipline, perhaps that are Latin American scholars that are not involved in any kind of popular movement. Tell us your story.
Well, sadly, I think that too many academics are academic in the worst sense of the word, of trying to be removed from reality. I like to joke that my discipline is sometimes known as the discipline of political silence rather than political science. But I think that it really, to study about and learn about critical issues creates a moral obligation to be involved and to do something, to act on these ideas that we're learning about and teaching. It's been really very relevant to be part of a group like ICPJ that's community-rooted, because then in participating in these conversations in the classroom, students are exposed to ways that they can get involved, and many students have. So, for instance, just recently, participating in a march to call attention to the disappeared students of Ayotzinapa, the state of Guerrero in Mexico. I was very happy to see two of my students there on the march, one who had taken time off from work and ran over to join the march for a stretch. And she has been so inspired that she's going to be going off to Cuba to study for a semester in the fall. So I think the real-world connection is really an important one. Really the two things, study and action, have to go hand in hand.
Well, again, I'm really glad that you feel that way, and we've benefited from your expertise and also your commitment. What I hear you saying is that, if I'm not wrong, that it actually makes you a better teacher in terms of helping your students make connections to yourself be rooted in a community effort.
Definitely. The student, it's really, we don't teach anything to anyone at a university. All we do is invite people to participate in a learning process. The Zapatistas refer to the teachers in their communities as education promoters rather than teachers because of this idea. It's more about kind of creating a space for critical thinking and dialogue, so that what students hopefully will come away from in an experience of a learning environment is learning how to learn rather than just collections of facts that are regurgitated for the exams. This is a time, unfortunately, when students are being over-tested and the emphasis is in all the wrong places in education.
Right. Well, and from my perspective as someone who has come myself to your class, has been invited as I've been in different places in Latin America or focusing on a particular issue that's timely. You have invited me, but you also have invited almost every guest that we have had as a task force, people that we have brought from Honduras, from Colombia, from El Salvador, from many different places. We have them, and we have a community event with them, speaking and educating others and calling them to action. And then you have them the next day or so at your class. And so that's been one of our great partnerships, academic and action. Are there any stories that you have about one of those times that was particularly touching or effective for the students?
Well, it has been great to break down those walls between universities, classrooms, and the community, and ICPJ is a wonderful resource for helping to do that. I mentioned the case of the disappearance of the Mexican students, and just recently this community group that sprung up called the Michigan Solidarity Network with Mexico has been having events to try to raise awareness, and I invited some of them to come into my class in Latin American politics and show a video clip and talk, and they broke down the students into small groups. It was a very animated discussion, and one of the students, as a result of that, has joined this community solidarity group and has been very involved, so that's an example, and it really is very moving for me. And speaking of breaking down the boundaries between sort of classroom community activism, I wanted to take a minute to remember that today, April 28th, is the anniversary of the killing of Ben Linder in Nicaragua in 1987. Ben was, at the time, a young man who had studied engineering and wanted to not just study, but make the connections to the people and how do we use knowledge in service of the people. So he, while he was in Nicaragua, he was, among many other things, a unicycle rider and a clown. He put those skills and talents and his exuberant personality and humor to work to help encourage kids to come in for vaccination campaigns in the popular health campaigns of the Sandinista period. And he went up to the mountains of Nicaragua to bring his engineering skills to try to deal with real-world problems in very poor areas. And he was instrumental in starting a project to build small-scale, appropriate technology, mini hydroelectric plants in rural communities that had no electricity. And it was really a transformative experience for these communities because it was participatory, because it wasn't just sitting in a classroom and lecturing people. And really, it's that transformation that the U.S. government saw and the powers in the United States saw as such a threat, that people could empower themselves in the most remote and poor corners of the world. And so Ben was tracked down and killed by the U.S.-sponsored Contras. And that's, also a real lesson of our own responsibility to continue these struggles. One of the slogans that is on Ben's tombstone and that kind of resonates from the time of the killing of Salvador Allende, another inspiring example, the president of Chile in the 1970s, is they can cut the flowers, but they can't stop the spring. So I think it's important to have that historical continuity of memories of struggle, and ICPJ has really served to do that, to keep these memories alive. The struggles for Central America aren't just the decade of the 1980s, they're really very much with us today.
Thank you for bringing that up, both about Ben and about historical memory and the importance. Just to say that Ben Linder was kept alive, has been kept alive, especially closer to his death. I went to a tree planting that we did as ICPJ along with Sister City at the Civic Center. What do we call that? The offices of the mayor. What is it called?
City Hall.
City Hall. Thank you. At City Hall. I'm sure it's not there anymore because it's all been remodeled and redone, and I'm not sure what happened. But this is a good time to say that throughout the 90s and the 2000s, and now we're into the 2000 teens, I guess, but especially in the 90s and 2000s, one of the things that ICPJ did, our Latin America Task Force, is every March 24th, we had a program that commemorated the assassination of Archbishop Romero of El Salvador, who was killed by an assassin that was trained at the School of the Americas and ordered, more importantly, by graduates of the School of the Americas at a time when the United States was funding the military and the government in El Salvador. And he was a tremendous voice for the dispossessed. And so every year we would remember him, but we would remember him by bringing up the issues of that day that were related to his quest for justice, whether it's in El Salvador or in neighboring Guatemala, Honduras, whatever. And we did that for years. We had beautiful events and that were educational and called people to action. And then, of course, so many of these anniversaries grew. Then Archbishop Romero was killed in 1980. Later in 1980, 4 North American churchwomen were murdered by soldiers, Salvadoran soldiers, raped and murdered and left to rot. Fortunately, their bodies were found. And we have commemorated their anniversary. And then in 1989, the 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and daughter. And we just this past November had a major commemoration for that anniversary, 25 years. And some people have asked us over the years, why are you talking about things that happened in the 80s? It's in the past. And what would your response to that be?
Well, that commemoration that was held recently, that ICPJ and Marianne played a central role in organizing recently on the anniversary of the killing of the 6 Jesuit priests and their housekeeper and the housekeeper's daughter in the Central American University campus in San Salvador. It was a very moving and well-attended remembrance. One of the things that was moving was the participation of Sylvia Nolasco Rivers, who is an extraordinary cook at Pilar's Tamales, but also someone who came to the United States as part of the sanctuary movement of religious congregations in the U.S. who took in people fleeing from the consequences of U.S. policies. And she spoke about her experience and kind of made that community connection of how she felt that she was taken in by this community and given shelter, and that she's sort of giving back to the community in that participation. And even after all these years, maybe it's justice delayed, but we're finally starting to see accountability for some of these horrific crimes. So, for instance, two of the generals who were involved in the worst atrocities in El Salvador have finally been found to have been participants by U.S. courts and deported from the U.S. so that they can potentially face trial. One deported to Spain and the other deported back to El Salvador. So history is never really in the past. It's never really entirely behind us. It's very much part of the present. And if we don't remember the past, then, as they say, we're doomed to repeat it. And there are connections to community issues. Right now we're seeing, in the age of cell phones and cameras, we're finally starting to see exposed police violence and the racist orientation of that violence, the structural violence in U.S. society, in Ferguson and Baltimore. And really it's the same kind of militarized response to social problems that we've been protesting in Central America and other parts of Latin America, and that we're seeing here too. Instead of addressing the root causes in social injustice, the response is simply to apply violence, and it just spreads the violence. So I think it's important to have those memories, because this isn't just about Central America in the 1980s and the nostalgia of the activists. This is about the ongoing issues today.
Thank you. And you brought up a really important piece of our work, which is the struggle against impunity. It's a funny word. It sounds very theoretical, but basically it's what you're saying, that unless we call out and remember and say again and again what happened, and try to do what we can to bring people to account, people who are perpetrators of this kind of violence that we're talking about, and the system, and in this case military that has been trained in this system, think that it's a norm, think that they can continue it, and it will continue. And if we cannot keep calling out what is not right and calling our government to account, even when it seems to fall on deaf ears. And that's what we're doing with every speaker we bring to town, every delegation that we take people on or go on, every film we show, every action in front of the federal building. We're saying we cannot allow ourselves to get away with this. We have to make a different, better world.
I think that's really an important point. Recently, Padre Melo, Father Ismael Moreno Coto from Honduras came as part of an ICPJ collaboration with other local groups, including the University of Detroit Mercy, to speak about the situation in Honduras. And one of the things that struck me in one of his talks is he said, I come to speak about Honduras, and people say to me, "What's Honduras?" There's so much forgetfulness. Maybe, Marianne, you were so involved in those events, you could talk a little bit about the message that Padre Melo had to bring for us.
Yes, well, Honduras is one of the issues right now today that we are focusing on, because there's such a tremendous human rights crisis in Honduras. And as you mentioned, the United States, not really to deal with the crisis, but for their own reasons, are funding the military and the police in greater and greater amounts in Honduras. And they are involved in perpetrating this violence against, you name the group, anyone who's poor or disenfranchised in any way, the peasant farmers, the indigenous people, the LGBT community, lawyers, journalists, and then human rights defenders, those who are trying to defend those people who have been pushed to the margins. It's a terrible, terrible situation that hardly anyone in the United States knows about or takes note of. And it is related to the horror and terror of the 1980s in Honduras, which was a staging ground for the United States to move against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and against and to involve ourselves in the civil war in El Salvador. And so it is once again the Committee of the Families of the Disappeared that was born in the 80s is busier than ever attending to the current day human rights atrocities and issues. And I'm so sad to say, I mean, after all of our work and all of our raising our voice, that the United States is so involved there, and to the point where we turned our face and said okay to a military coup in 2009 in Honduras. So this is one of the things that we are currently raising up and trying to educate people about and cry out about. And it's very related to another one of our issues, which is the crisis of immigration from the region, from Honduras, from El Salvador and Guatemala, and particularly young people who are having to flee the tremendous violence and poverty in the region. So we could say all these years, I personally have been doing this solidarity work for over 30 years. I'm grateful for the vehicle that ICPJ has been for me in the times that I have, the long time that I've spent in Ann Arbor. And our work isn't done, and we need to continue on. And I'm happy to have Rich, Rebecca, Gregory, Tobi, Jane, and others to work with on this.
I'd like to say that I think ICPJ gives people an answer to the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. Once you've learned how our government is not living up to its democratic ideals, and our congregations, our denominations are not living up to our faith values, once those things are painful, it's wonderful to have Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice as a place where you can meet wonderful people who are hopeful and active and educated on the issues, who can give you all sorts of ways where you can learn more about how things are and how they should be, and also what you can do. And you're not on your own. You're part of a group of supportive people working together. So it really helps combat the despair that leads to apathy and complacency, I think.
It makes a big difference to have like-minded people that you can be with. I talked a little earlier, this is Mary Ann, I talked a little earlier about coming back to Ann Arbor and having been part of Interfaith before, and then 9 years later knowing exactly where to go when I came back. And I have had the privilege over these years, the first time in 1994, going on delegations to Latin American countries. And I've been to throughout Central America, or most of it, over these years, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Rich has spent time in innumerable amount of time in Mexico, and Rebecca had a wonderful opportunity to be part of a Prisoners of Conscience delegation to Chile. And I'll speak for myself, and they can speak for themselves, but when one goes on a delegation and does this kind of learning, this kind of a mini immersion in hearing the stories of the actual people themselves, it enriches one very much. It creates these connections and bonds with people in Latin America. But that's not enough that I know about it, and that I get to have this opportunity, this experience. The whole point is to bring it back here and be able to share it and to educate others. That's the reason for going, is to spread the word. And if I were coming back to a town that did not have a vehicle ready-made, it would be really difficult. I couldn't do this work, and I probably wouldn't be going on as many delegations. But many times I've been given the opportunity through our task force to address people, to have an event. You know, the Marianne reporting back from El Salvador, from Colombia.
First-hand reports.
That sort of thing. And going to Rich's classes, and another professor that's part of our task force at Wayne State, going to her classes. And we've woven a community of people who want to help get the word out. And that's what makes us able to continue to do our work. Because if we just had to come back and put it on a shelf, and have some photographs and an album, we wouldn't be dynamic. And the last thing I want to say on this is that in terms of the hope we see, Latin America itself gives us a lot of hope. Latin America is not stuck in the 80s, even though maybe some of the powers that be would like them to be. But the words in the themes in Latin America are sovereignty. Our countries, our peoples want to be in charge of our destiny, and that we don't want to look to the north all of the time. And several countries have made tremendous shifts, and young people are engaged, and there are social movements throughout. Rich studies that. He can talk about that. And we're partnering with them more and more. Nationally, our SOA Watch movement, of which we're a part, is partnering more and more with counterparts in Latin America, because we say, somos una America. We are one America, looking at the whole hemisphere. And that those of us who are looking for a different kind of world, that is not interested just in consuming and in making more money and making a small group of us comfortable, but is looking to take care of the planet, to have sustainability for all people, those of us who are doing that are getting together, and we're working toward the same thing. And I find a lot of hope in that, and I hope to make more of that evident here in Ann Arbor and in Michigan through our continuing work as a task force.
I just want to say that sometimes, this is Rich, in the midst of a struggle, it's hard to see where things are going and what the outcome is going to be. Gandhi once said, reflecting back on his long struggle for independence of India, he said, reflecting on that historical experience, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So it really does sort of proceed in those stages. And it was something that really stuck with me back in the struggles of the 1980s that seemed so hopeless against the U.S. intervention in Central America. I went to a rally once in San Francisco, and Daniel Ellsberg came and spoke. He was the one who leaked the Pentagon Papers of the Vietnam War. And he said, all you are gathered on a nice day here in San Francisco, and you're probably thinking to yourselves, what difference can we possibly be making? How are we going to stop this juggernaut in Central America? He said, but that's what we all were wondering back in the days when we were all chipping away in Vietnam, until finally the day came when Lyndon Johnson heard from his FBI director that he wasn't going to be able to contain the dissent anymore, and the whole thing started to unravel. He said, so you just have to put your shoulders to the wheel and have confidence that things are going to move in a positive direction through everybody's collective energy. And as Marianne was saying, I think that the social movements in Latin America are really an inspiration. A lot of the movements these days are not playing the traditional political game of how can we get someone elected, how can we influence one of those elected officials. Rather, they're redefining what we mean by power and realizing that we have the power. We just have to exercise it at the grassroots and not pay attention to the wrongdoings of the people above, and if necessary, act in civil disobedience against unjust authority, but stick to what's right and organize in that way, as though we are powerful, because really collectively as people we are.
One thing for me is I've been going down to Columbus, Georgia every November since 1997, taking the 1 year off when I was in prison in 2001. And the first year I drove through the night. The car had a little problems, but we got there. And after that, I flew for many years. And now the last few years, I've either been taking the bus or driving. And it is a long drive. It's 13 to 14 hours. And it's a hassle. And every year I'm like, this is the last year I'm going to go here. But there's something about being there. There's many reasons to be there, but one of the reasons I want to talk about is the feeling of support, of raising my spirit, of being with comrades, like-minded people. And it gives me energy for the year to continue my work. And I think that is not a small thing. And I think we all need to look for those situations. And we try and build it a little here in Ann Arbor when we do our programming, and we have. But it is an amazing thing about going there. One time, before we plan our delegation, we do a lot of outreach in the community. We've brought in speakers. We go and speak at places. And one year, Marianne and I spoke at St. Mary's student parish in Ann Arbor on campus. And it was like we had a plant in the audience. This one person raises his hand, and he said, when I went last year for the first time, it was as if I was in the presence of God, and how rare that is in life. And that, for a faith-based organization, it's a really important thing. And so I suppose I will continue going down, and gives me the hope and it gives me the energy to continue the work that we do in our lives here in Ann Arbor.
That reminds me of the last time, just this past fall, we had Father Roy Bourgeois come again to Ann Arbor to speak. We've had him several times over these many years. And a group of students from Kalamazoo drove for an hour and a half or so. These are students that Tobi helped to get to Fort Benning the year before.
And she paid their gas money to come, or lent her car for them to come to Ann Arbor.
Yes, lent her car for them to come to
From
Ann Arbor.
Kalamazoo.
She's still contributing to the cause all the way from Kalamazoo. And so they came for that evening to hear Roy speak. And at one point, something was asked about what happens there, and what actually, people go, but then what happens after Fort Benning. And this young woman raised her hand and stood up, and she said, we have this action in Kalamazoo. Every week we're out at such and such a place where they're manufacturing parts for drones, and we are a peace group working nonviolently against drone warfare and against drones. And we learned everything that we know about drones from a workshop at the School of the Americas protest and vigil last year at Fort Benning. Because the question was, is our movement, the SOA Watch movement, only about closing the school, which after all has not closed since we've been working on it since so many years. And for me, that was one of the most hopeful things. I know this about our vigil there and our workshops that so much is offered, along with the camaraderie and the spirit of working together that Rebecca referred to. But to hear someone articulate it that way, that they have been resourced as young people through our movement, and that they are connecting the dots, and they're working where they are with what they have and what's in front of them. And I'm going to sound like an old person now, but as we always say, young people getting involved is a source of great hope for all of us. And I'm sure that Rich has to feel that with his students. And we feel it very much with the number of young people who are involved in our movement to close the SOA. And that we just saw the campus have a kind of a mini explosion when the parents and family members of the 43 disappeared from Ayotzinapa, Mexico, were here, where sprang up an intense interest by students when they can get that close to something. So I feel a great deal of hope with that, and it goes all the way back to garbage trucks going to Huigalpa, Nicaragua, when we can put a human face on policies and consequences. And I see that as our major job, is to continue to put a human face on all of this and make all of these connections.
This is Tobi. When we talked about the 5 cents a plate dinner, rice and beans, to protest the $500 a plate dinner that Tom Monahan organized to build the cathedral in Managua, we didn't mention how much our action impacted the fundraising, because we got a huge amount of press for our protests. All of a sudden, the fundraising decision was made that a health clinic would be built next to the cathedral, and that the people in the parishes here in Ann Arbor and everywhere else affected could designate their funds to go to the health clinic instead of the cathedral if they wanted. We changed the debate, the dialogue. We made a huge difference by really holding up the values. I have one of the many flyers that was created for one of our events. This was one of the anniversaries of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero. It's got a whole list of action options so that whoever comes, wherever they are on their life's journey, there's a way that they can participate. And to me, that's one of the big values that's so hopeful at Interfaith Council, that when you go, you find out there are things you can do, and you don't have to go to Fort Benning or to El Salvador or somewhere far away. There are really important things you can do in your daily life. For instance, one of the options here is to buy fair trade. As much as possible, buy fair trade coffee, fair trade chocolate, fair trade clothes, which is what I'm wearing.
Tobi.
Another option is join a credit union instead of a bank. Shop at a food co-op instead of another kind of grocery store. Never walk in stores we won't name that exploit their workers. Choose instead, because every dollar that you spend is a vote to support one system or another. What are you going to support with every dollar you spend?
And every program we always talk about what is the action item going to be, whether it's sending postcards, sending messages. That's a critical part of our programming.
And there are all these other options of fasting to understand what it feels like to be hungry. So many of our brothers and sisters across Latin America and the rest of the world. Letter writing, who to write to. Join a solidarity group, the list of possibilities. Educate yourself and others, the films, the books that will help you understand the situation. Eat at Rice and Beans. Be part of the gathering together of a group of people where you will find help and hope on what we can do. So I find being part of ICPJ very helpful and hopeful on every level. I would encourage everybody to do it, and I was so sad to move away. But I want to tell you, it doesn't matter where you are. You can be part, because Interfaith Council connects you to the national work. It's not about just what happens in Ann Arbor. We're part of something bigger that other people are working on from many other university towns, many other big cities all across the country, and rural places too.